Okay, good morning, everyone. I have a handout for you all, which I think you'll find informative and useful. And for those who would like a copy of the text, I have a few copies of that as well. And I hope you had a nice Yom Tov, everyone, a nice Chag. Okay. So we are now on chapter 17 of the first section of Moreh Nevukhim. In order for us to really make sense of what the Rambam is going to be telling us in this atypical chapter for what we've seen up until now, we need to get a little bit in depth, sort of knee-deep into Greek philosophy. So I know it's early in the morning, and I know that your minds are just starting to get into gear, but please bear with me. The handout that I gave you is basically just something that I found online that tries to explain Aristotle's approach to change. Now, what do I mean by change? Aristotle had an important idea. His idea was that things that are perfect as they are don't change. And the world, as a general rule, doesn't change. And therefore, if things are the way that they're meant to be, how can change ever take place? This brought Aristotle to a very, very broad conclusion, and that is that there was no such thing as creation, as Genesis. Because the whole concept of creation requires us to believe that at one point there was a necessity for change, from nothingness to somethingness. And Aristotle felt that everything as it is now must have always been the way it has been, because what necessitated a change? There's nothing apparent in creation that necessitated for it to change from what it previously had been. And therefore, everything that it is as it is today is as it has always been. One of the things that I mentioned over the Chag, I don't remember which drush I mentioned it in, is that Aristotle had argued, therefore, for what we call the eternity of existence, or the eternity of everything that is. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, as well as the Rambam, both acknowledge that there is soundness to this theory. In other words, using philosophical speculation, there is reasonableness. There's logic dictates that Aristotle is correct, but there is a counter argument to be made for the narrative of creation, and it is equally logical. You just both sides are presented with challenges, logical challenges. Both narratives can be reconciled with logic in some way. And therefore, the reason why we go with the creation narrative instead of the eternal existence narrative is for one reason and one reason only. It's because we have a Mesorah. We have a Torah that Hashem gave us that tells us that God created the world. If we had no such transmission of the origin of our existence, there would be nothing compelling us to argue for a creation at some point in history. If anything, we could have come up with the opposite conclusion, that everything is as it always has been. And so therefore, you see, there's one section in this handout that talks about puzzles about change. We know that this was a topic that puzzled Aristotle's predecessors. Plato said that real things, what he calls forms, don't change, and restricted change to the realm of appearances, the physical world. Now, Aristotle breaks down the world into sort of two things, or two concepts, form and matter. We've spoken about this idea before, and it's quite important and relevant for the entirety of Moreh Nevukhim for a person to start thinking in Aristotelian terms. I should point out that this is not unique to the Moreh Nevukhim. There are many early medieval and even late medieval Jewish thinkers who use Aristotelian terminology to describe all that exists in terms of form and matter. How do you say form in Hebrew? Anyone? No, tsura. Tsura is form. And how do you say matter? Chomer. Chomer and tsura, matter and form. Those are the terms. Anyone who studies Maharal, who was late in the game when it comes to Aristotelian philosophy, he lived at a time in the 16th century when Aristotelian philosophy was becoming passé. It was almost on its way out, and the Maharal adopted much of the terminology of Aristotle, which he received from his forebears, in trying to make sense of the world and all of that exists around us, the world that God created in terms of Chomer and Tsura. Okay? And it clearly is in Kabbalistic literature as well, the terms Chomer and Tsura, but it originates with Aristotle. Now, if something which is form, as Plato said, is the truest reality, it is the most real thing, because it is unchanging and it exists outside of our physical world. What do I mean by form? It's the idea that gives shape to anything in the physical world. The example that we gave in the past, which we'll always come back to, is the chair that is right next to me. The chair is a composite of form and matter. It has the form of a chair. Where did that form come from? It came from the minds of the people who created it. What is the matter of the chair? What is the chomer of the chair? It's the metal, it's the fabric, it's the threads that make the upholstery, it's the padding. All of that had to be shaped into something, and it was shaped into something by the mind of the artisan who manufactured the chair. Okay? So that's everything that exists. You can't have pure matter and you can't have pure form existing in our world. Everything that exists in our world is a composite of form and matter. The question, though, is, what does this have to do with change? So what it has to do with change is, how do things change in our world? If Aristotle believed in steady stateness, that everything is as it should be and nothing should change, how do things change? There has to be a third ingredient in our universe, and he says this in his Physics, his book called Physics. There has to be something else that exists that gives rise to change. What gives rise to change? When matter senses a deficiency within itself, that deficiency is the third ingredient that is necessary for change. When matter experiences or senses deficiency within itself, it calls upon itself, so to speak, form to attach to it, and that form changes the matter. So, Aristotle gave two examples of this in his book of Physics, which I have underlined for you. The two examples that he gives are a man, you'll like this, Yisrael, a man who was unmusical becomes musical. So you have a human being, does not know anything about music, cannot play the trumpet. So he goes to a master trumpeter, and who teaches him how to play trumpet. He now, after years of study, now becomes a musical person. So when we want to describe the matter and the form and the deficiency in those three ingredients, which cause this person to change from an unmusical person to a musical person, the human being that was previously unmusical is the matter. The form is the musicalness that he acquired over the course of his training. And the deficiency was his state of being unmusical, which in some way impelled him to acquire musicalness. Yeah.
Just a quick statement, I'm sure the Rebbe's going to speak about it. I don't believe if anyone, you have to be born with certain things that are not your choice. So if you weren't born with the ability to be a Rav or to be a
Correct.
Musician.
Right. So Aristotle would agree with that. Aristotle would tell you that there are certain types of matter which are more connective to certain types of form. So a person, when we bring it back to the analogy, certain people are born with a propensity towards musicality, and therefore they seek out the form of musicalness, or musicality. I don't know what the word is. Okay.
where is the matter in an ability?
Well, it's in form. Form is the ability.
Form is the
So
ability.
a human being is the unformed human being, meaning that he doesn't have that ability yet.
Correct.
The form is that ability that he acquires, the musical ability.
Right.
And the deficiency that was necessary for him to connect to that musical ability was the deficiency, was that lack that he had of being musical.
So it's adding additional form
So,
to
right.
the matter.
And by the way, you understand that this inserts a sense of some level of sentience within all that exists.
Which means?
A sense of awareness, like an unformed rock is aware that it lacks some level of form, and so it seeks out form to make it into something that is smooth and square and cubical or whatever it is. Okay? The second example that Aristotle gave is shapeless bronze, a hunk of metal, of bronze, and it becomes a statue. So in that case, the subject or the matter is bronze, the form is statue, and the privation, what we're going to see is called privation or deficiency, is its shapelessness. And there's a sense that the matter has that it is shapeless. It seeks out form to make it whole or to make it become more than what it previously was. And that's how change takes place in the physical world. People change, hunks of metal change. All things that are given to change can only change because of a differing relationship between the form and the matter that is creating the composite. And that drive to change arises out of the awareness or some level of consciousness of deficiency or what we call privation. Okay? That's what we're going to be discussing today in the Moreh Nevukhim in this chapter. Now, why the Rambam addresses it specifically here, I'm going to get to that shortly, but that's sort of the necessary introduction. So comes along the Rambam. Let's begin the text. Do not think that only the divine science should be withheld from the multitude. Now here the Rambam is talking about esoteric knowledge. What do I mean by the word esoteric? By esoteric, we've talked about this idea very extensively when we looked at the introduction to the Moreh Nevukhim, is that the Rambam believes that certain information should be hidden from people who are not prepared to hear it. You can't handle the truth, is the famous Jack Nicholson line. And the Rambam says there are certain people who can't handle certain pieces of information. When it comes to information about metaphysics or about God, the divine realm, those things have to be hidden. But the Rambam says, I'll go even one step further. Not only divine science should be withheld from the multitude. This holds good also for the greater parts of natural science, or what he would call physics. There's metaphysics, which is about the heavens and the divinity, and then there's physics, which is about the natural order of the world. Even that, there are some people who are not ready to fully understand it, and it has to be therefore presented esoterically, which means you give a surface veneer to the information and you don't reveal it outright. Which means also that you can sometimes speak in riddles or metaphors. And this is what all of Moreh Nevukhim is about, speaking in riddles and metaphors. Okay? Now, in fact, we have repeatedly set down for you our dictum, the account of the beginning, or Maisa Bereshis, should not be taught in the presence of two men. This is a Mishnah in Chagiga that the Rambam said forms the foundation of Moreh Nevukhim, which is that you don't teach Ma'aseh Bereshit publicly, and you certainly don't teach Ma'aseh Merkava, which is the act of the chariot, which he said is divine science or metaphysics. You certainly have to restrict that even further. This is not only the case with regard to people adhering to law, but also with regard to the philosophers and learned men of the various communities in ancient times. Meaning, this is not just a Torah principle. This is not just a halachic imperative that you should not reveal hidden truths of the Torah to unsophisticated Jewish people, But it applies, it's a universal concept, that even when you're discussing secular philosophy, which, by the way, according to the Rambam, there's no real thing as secular philosophy, but even this applies to non-Jews as well. It's a universal concept that when you're discussing very lofty ideas, you do not reveal them outright to people who are not prepared to be able to accept them and understand them properly.
But why? Why?
Because it can be damaging, it can be injurious. Just like if you try to reveal state secrets to someone who could use them to be destructive politically, information that a person is not yet ready to understand can be used destructively in that own person's life. They can misinterpret it, they can come to the wrong conclusions about things, and then carry out their lives in a destructive manner. That's the general idea. And so, as an example of this, he says, they concealed what they said about the first principles and presented it in riddles. What does he mean by first principles? The basic building blocks of all of creation. Thus, Plato and his predecessors designated matter as the female and form as the male. Now, what does he mean? What he means to say is, Plato spoke in metaphors. He said that there's form in matter, said Plato, and Aristotle picked up even more on this. And he said that form is male and matter is female. Because when you think about it, when you think about male and female relationships, the male acts upon the female receives the male. So when you want to describe the process of form and matter becoming a composite unit, you describe it in terms of the male bonding with the female. Now that's a metaphor. So Plato is an example of how a secular philosopher, a non-Jewish philosopher, in describing natural science, speaks metaphorically. Now, if that's the whole idea that the Rambam wants to present to us, he could have stopped the chapter here. Now let's see where he goes on. He continues. Now you know that the principles of the existence subject to generation and corruption are three: matter, form, and particularized privation, which is always conjoined with matter. This is really just a fancy way of saying what I started this class with today, which is there are three ingredients, according to Aristotle, which give rise to change. There's the existence of matter and form, and the recognition within matter that there's something missing, that there's some deficiency which prompts it to sort of call form to bond with it. For were it not for this conjunction with privation, matter would not receive form. It is in this sense that privation is to be considered as one of the principles. It's one of the ingredients of existence. However, when a form is achieved, the particular privation in question, the privation of the form that is achieved, disappears, and another privation is conjoined with matter, and this goes on forever, as has been made clear in natural science. What he's basically saying is this change continues continuously throughout the world, in that things are continuously evolving and changing. Because once matter receives one level of change, it has its privation removed, it's alleviated itself of privation, of that deficiency, but then there's a tendency for matter to always never be satisfied, so as it were, with its current state of being matter bonded with form, and it seeks out, it acquires a new level of privation, which means that, to go back to our analogy of the man who's unmusical. So today he's unmusical, and over the course of a year he becomes musical. But then he realizes that he's only learned to play the trumpet, but now he wants to learn to play the guitar. So, in other words, at one point he caused the privation to disappear, the trumpeting skill, he caused that to disappear because now he's acquired trumpeting ability. But now he discovers within himself that he can't play guitar now. So he discovers a new level of privation, which he again seeks to fill. And that causes the next chapter of change in his life, which is to go from not only being a non-trumpeter to a trumpeter, but also from a non-guitarist to a guitarist, and so forth and so on. And so that's the process by which things continue, not only change once, but continue to change in constant iterations of change, and keep going on and on from there. So, basically, however, when a form is achieved, the particular privation in question, we just read that. Now, as even those upon whom the charge of corruption would not be laid in the event of clear exposition use terms figuratively and resorted to teaching in similes, how much all the more is it incumbent upon us, the community of those adhering to the Torah, not to state explicitly a matter that is either remote from the understanding of the multitude, or the truth of which, as it appears in the imagination of these people, is different from what is intended by us. Know this also. And so he concludes the chapter by basically saying that if philosophers use this technique of metaphor to mask the reality of what they were trying to communicate, in order to be able to protect people from knowledge that they're not prepared for, then certainly this should be true when it comes to people who are studying Torah, to really, really lofty ideas. How much more so is it incumbent upon us to make sure that people do not err in their understanding of very, very deep concepts of Torah, and get it wrong and then misinterpret it. And so therefore we have to be very careful as we proceed. And that's the whole message that the Rambam is communicating in this chapter, which is, as we've mentioned in the introduction to the Moreh Nevukhim, we need to speak esoterically, because some people will misinterpret what we say if we say it outright. We therefore have to use metaphor. We have to use analogy. We have to use all different kinds of literary devices to mask carefully what the truths of what we are saying are. So the first question is, why here? Why is the Rambam introducing this idea specifically in the 17th chapter of the first section of Moreh Nevukhim? And we've always striven to provide some level of continuity to what the Rambam's discussion. So if you recall, I know it's been a long time ago since we discussed the previous chapter, chapter 16, but I want you to recall what chapter 16 was all about. Chapter 16 was about the word tsur, which is what? What does the word tsur mean? A rock. A rock. And who is known as the ultimate rock? Hashem himself is known as the ultimate rock. God himself is known as the ultimate rock. Now, there's an interesting coincidence. The word rock is tsur. What's the word for form?
Same word.
Tsura. Now, why if tsur... Remember, what did Plato say? That form is the male and matter is the female. Let me ask you a question. Is the word for form in Hebrew a male word or a female word?
Male.
Tsura
Is female.
is female. That's usually the way you conjugate a feminine word, is by the word tsura. So what is being alluded to over here is that even though in a philosophical model that is devoid of God, there is only form that is the ultimate actor upon the ultimate male quality, which acts upon the ultimate female matter, which is the recipient. But there is something that acts upon form, and that is the ultimate male. Hashem ish milchama. God is the ultimate male. And therefore God is above form in his maleness, in his male quality. So therefore, someone says to you, okay, let's get a little PC, right? Is God male or female? God is not only male, he is the ultimate male, because he acts upon that which is considered by the philosophers to be the ultimate male. Vis-a-vis God, form is feminine, because form is manipulated by God to act upon matter. So when looking at the system of exchange between form and matter, it's true that form is male. But when looking at the larger system of how God operates the universe, then even form is female in the respect that it receives its instructions of action from the Almighty, from the Ribono Shel Olam. That's the continuity over here, because ultimately the reason why the Rambam introduces us to this idea of God being the Tzur is to remind us that even though we're going to be delving into philosophical ideas, we must also remember that the philosophers only looked at a sort of a smaller view of all of reality absent of God. Once we expand the aperture of our view, we see that even form receives from Hashem, who is the tzur acting upon the tzura. Okay, so that's the reason why it's over here. Now, the other important thing that some of the commentaries point out, and with this I think we'll have to conclude, is the following. The Rambam is also using the whole metaphor of form and matter, and that third ingredient that Aristotle talked about, which is the idea of change. He's using that to describe the human mind as well. Remember, the human being in general can be described as either form or matter, depending upon the context. So remember, in our chair example, where does the chair get its form from? From the mind of the artisan who manufactures the chair. So in that sense, the mind provides form. But in another context, the mind is also matter in that it receives divine knowledge from the Almighty that implants knowledge into our minds. What is it that causes us to constantly be changing in our intellect, in our thought process? It is the matter aspect of our mind which links itself to that deficiency, which makes us constantly aware that there is something missing from our thinking, that we are constantly striving to receive the additional form that will give rise to new thinking and will make our mind different from what it was yesterday. So, basically, the human mind is constantly hungry. That is the tendency of the human mind. It is constantly hungry to fill that deficiency that Aristotle said is that third ingredient of all of existence. That being the case, the Rambam is also alluding to the fact, do you know why I have to be so careful in masking information? Because the more I feed you, the more hungry you shall become for more knowledge.
Like this year.
And therefore, says the Rambam, I have to know how to mask things properly so that you are ingesting the knowledge in the proper measure and in the proper way, so that you don't, like if a person drinks too quickly or eats too quickly, they can get ill, they can have a very, very violent negative reaction. We have to feed you this information very slowly because your tendency is to be ravenously hungry for more and more information. And therefore, knowing the nature of matter and form and that deficiency that exists within matter, and knowing that your mind works on that way, and all of our minds work on that way, I have to be exceedingly careful to not force feed you or not excessively feed you, not give you too much information as we go along this process. And here the Rambam is giving us pause to realize that everything that he is doing is in very, very measured cadence to make sure that we don't step into a ravine that we're just not prepared for, and we're going to injure ourselves. So that's where we are at this point. Questions, comments? Yes, Yisrael. Okay, then Izzy or Yisrael.
Science, I'm not a scientist, but I'm into this a little bit, has discovered over the last, 20 years, 30 years, that there's such a thing as neuroplasticity, that your brain not only, can physically enlarge, change.
That's right. Exactly.
So
the neurons, right, and new links and new...
So that sort of supports
yes.
the desire, actually. There's a physical component to it. That's all I want to say.
Very good. Excellent. Izzy?
One of the, it looks to me like one of the trappings is that, why it makes sense is that you look at man, and man, you can equate yourself to God, that you also have control over matter, and you can create form, and you have to be careful that you don't think you're God, because you have these capabilities.
Correct. But, using Plato's analogy, there's a little bit of maleness and a little bit of femaleness in all of us, right? Mm-hmm. And a little bit of matter, a little bit of form in all of us. And we have to know when to exercise the matter and when to exercise the form.
And then don't forget what's
and don't forget what's above us, which is the real tzur. Okay. Good. Have a great day, everyone.